Always nice to start with an ovation, so thank you. Hello everyone, welcome to the Alice Mackay Room at the Vancouver Public Library. My name's Jorge Amigo and I'm the head of cultural programming here. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to share that I'm an immigrant from Mexico and therefore I'm a settler in these lands, which means I have a responsibility to continuously learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world and to bring that awareness into my daily work, not only as a private citizen, but also as a public servant for your library. It's great to see all of you here tonight for another one of this year's phenomenal Incite events. We're very grateful for the Vancouver Writers Festival, who bring some of the best writers in the world to this stage, so thank you for all you do. We've had a great run of the series so far, so quick question. Who here has never been to an Incite event and this is your first one? Raise your hand. Okay, very few of you, that's great. Which I guess means that a lot of you have been to a few. So can you raise your hand if you've been to one or more this season already? Amazing, okay, repeat customers. So before I pass it on to Leslie, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. The first one, the most obvious one, is please silence your cell phones. That's because noises from your cell phone are very disruptive to your fellow audience members, but also to people on stage. You don't have to turn them off because we actually encourage you to take pictures or videos because we want the world to know that you are in a library event. But just make sure your phone is silent. The second housekeeping note is there are bathrooms outside. So if you need to use the toilet, please exit through the back door over there. This one is a little more disruptive. So you go through that one, go around there, and the bathrooms are right in front of that door. You're welcome to come in and out as many times as you want. We're not in the opera and it's not the ballet, so you're allowed to come in. So it's my pleasure now to introduce, to pass the torch to Leslie Herdig, who is the artistic director of the Vancouver Writers Festival.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And good evening and welcome to Incite. Tonight we are honored to host Vincent Lam in conversation with Daniel Calla about his radiant and urgent new novel On the Ravine. And we're so glad to see so many of you here in person tonight at the VPL, and a big shout out to everyone watching from home. Hello to you as well. We would like to acknowledge also that the Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're cognizant of the urgency and the nature of the work that still needs to occur as we move toward Indigenous sovereignty. Great thanks to the Vancouver Public Library for all of their collaboration and support with this Incite series. It's hard to believe we are halfway through already for 2023. Thank you also to all of our government sponsors, which include the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. Just a reminder that this series runs until May the 30th, with our next Incite event happening on April the 5th, which is a celebration of Poetry Month. We hope you'll turn out for that one as well. In addition to Incite and our annual October Festival, we run special events throughout the year, including our just announced bestseller series coming this May. Please join us as we present Margaret Atwood on the 7th of May, and then Louise Penny on May the 13th, which, by the way, is Mother's Day, and I think this would make such a good Mother's Day gift for anyone in your life who happens to be a mom, as well as R.F. Kwong on May 22nd. Information and tickets on all of these events can be found on our website. Soon I am going to turn things over, I promised, to our excellent host, Daniel Calla, who will speak with Vincent before taking a selection of your questions, which we've collected ahead of this event this evening. Questions can still be asked, but you need to do it via email to our info account. And if you want to do that, that address is info@writersfest.bc.ca. And for those of you watching from home, you can ask questions via the live chat in your YouTube channel. Following their conversation, Vincent will be available to sign books over here, courtesy of our wonderful booksellers, Black Bond Book Warehouse. And I think that's all of the housekeeping notes. Sorry for the longevity. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Daniel Calla, a prolific author of gripping bestsellers, as well as an esteemed ER physician at St. Paul's Hospital here in Vancouver. Dan's 14 novels to date delve into themes and topics as diverse as superbugs, prisons, DNA evidence, pandemics, vaccine hesitancy, and patient abuse. He is no stranger to the urgent focus of Vincent Lam's new novel and shares the achievement of not only working closely with patients whose lives have been deeply affected by addiction, but also having written about the opioid crisis in his 2019 novel, The Last High. Our special guest this evening is the Scotiabank Giller Prize-winning author of the gorgeous short story collection, Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures. On the Ravine is his second novel, and one that is garnering praise for its precise and very real appraisal of the current opioid crisis and the many walks of life it affects. From the at-odds but well-meaning physicians who treat the addicts, to the concert violinist who suffers deeply from the effects of poison drugs and the grip they have on her. As a physician who has worked in both emergency and addiction medicine, Vincent Lam knows the effect that addiction and overdose has on his patients and the medical system. As the Globe and Mail recently said, Vincent Lam manages a small miracle in On the Ravine. He turns the dreary sameness of addiction, as well as its bureaucracies, into compelling narrative, a roller coaster in intimate detail that leaves his readers shivering next to his protagonists. Please welcome Daniel Calla and Vincent Lam.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jorge and Leslie, for the introductions and the invitations. And really, sorry, can you, is that better? Okay, perfect. That could have been an editorial choice by our host. But really, it's truly my honor and privilege tonight to interview a very esteemed colleague of mine who's both a fellow doctor and a fellow writer. One who I admire greatly and resent only slightly for his abundance of accomplishments and talents. I think Leslie gave you a brief bio of Vincent's really impressive and diverse career. He's traversed the world of medicine, from emergency medicine to now becoming an addiction specialist, which is truly one of the forefronts of medicine these days. He's written, obviously a Giller Prize-winning book of collection of short stories that was, took the country by storm and later became an HBO miniseries. He wrote a Governor General Literary Award shortlisted first novel, also the Commonwealth Book Prize shortlist, and he has also written prolifically in nonfiction, including the recent textbooks, Opioid Agonist Therapy, A Prescriber's Guide to Treatment, that was published only last year. He's also published a biography of Tommy Douglas. So really, there's a lot to cover in our talk this evening. His book kept me up late, and I'm tired. But for those who haven't read it yet, you really have to. On the Ravine is a beautifully written, powerful story of addiction and the struggle to overcome and or survive it. And it's written with such an incredible insider's perspective. It's powerful, harrowing, at times even difficult to read, but incredibly worthwhile read. And he makes fiction matter, and he makes it personal by giving the perspectives of both the insider and the outsider, the treater and the victim, and he does it consistently with compassion and eloquence in his writing. I think before we start talking about it, I was just going to invite Vincent to read a passage from his book Dan, maybe you could set up for us the passage you're going to read.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan. This is on, yes? Okay, all right. I can never quite tell from this vantage point. And before I begin reading, I just want to thank you very much, Dan, for being here. And it's really great to be here with an equally esteemed colleague. And I really felt at home when you weren't sure whether it was morning or evening, because I thought, you know, this is clearly an emerge doc.
Yeah, exactly. It's,
This is a shift worker right here. And so I thought, yes, I'm with my people. I'll read a little bit from On the Ravine. And I'm going to read to you from the moment that the reader meets Claire. And you'll get to meet her at the same time. Pounding and the rattle of the locked door latch. Claire, are you okay? Are you in there? Aching neck. The sea green tiles a blur, and then they resolved into squares as grout lines wobbled into focus. Her nose and the side of her face were pressed into the grab bar. She must have slipped off the toilet and now found herself half wedged between the bowl and the wall, her arms folded in front of her like a closed book or a prayer. She tried to get up, and at first her legs would not push her up out of their tangle. She sank forward onto her knees, thinking, I missed the best part. From outside, the voices of children from the beginner violin class she was supposed to be teaching. Where is Miss Claire? Is she all right? Another declared with excitement. I saw her go in there, Miss Francis. It looked like she was going to barf. Had she told her class that she was going to the bathroom, or did she just slip away while they were doing an exercise? The horsehair screeching over strings had grated more than usual, pulled her skin up through itself. It wasn't only the sound, and it would take just a minute to fix herself. She had been trying to teach the fluid bow arm how to glide across the bridge rather than grinding down into the strings. But the morning shot hadn't lasted like it should, and her own sore arm had been shaky. Then an unexpected burst of the sweats. Now, she recalled stopping, turning to the children. Show me. Your turn. Then a blank, and now she was in the bathroom. Is this one already fading? She thought with sorrow, as she had hoped that the warmth would float her back to class, turn the noise into melodies. I'm here, Claire said, pulling herself up with the grab bar, lightheaded. Give me a minute. She steadied herself at the sink. The grab bar had left a red mark, a diagonal slash across her otherwise pale face. She splashed water over her eyes, her cheeks, and then felt a jab in her arm. She jumped, and the syringe sprang free, clattered under the sink. Shit. The tourniquet was still tightly wound over her bicep. Are you in there, Claire? 1 second. With the pills, it had once been possible to get it just right. She could swallow a 20 milligram oxy at the start of an afternoon and still be coasting cheerily at the end of 2 beginner group lessons. If she felt her energy waning, she might pop 5 more milligrams, 10 at the most, as a treat. But she had never ended up on the floor in the bathroom. Coming! Of course, by the time she switched to heroin, the down, she no longer even felt a 20. and now everyone said it was different, that a lot of the junk wasn't even heroin anymore. But her connect assured her about his connect. Get yourself together, Claire. Trying to rub away the red mark just seemed to make it worse.
That was powerful and great to hear you read it in your voice. And I was going to save Claire. I was going to save her for later because she's such a powerful character. I was going to get to her later in our conversation, but since you started there, let's start, because to me she was actually the most, moving character. I mean, all the characters come to life in your story, but she really struck a chord with me. And so Claire is this intelligent, kind, beautiful, musical prodigy who's also, like many of us, very damaged. But she really becomes your primary representative, as I read it, of what an opioid addict is. I mean, as you and I both know, we've both worked with substance use dependent patients for years, and we know there's no such thing as an ordinary addict. They come in a million different sizes, flavors, and colors, and each has their own story. But I wonder why you chose such a accomplished artist as that representation of someone falling so, desperately down that hole of addiction.
Sure, that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right in saying that the diversity amongst people who suffer from substance use disorders and from an opioid use disorder is as diverse as the people in this room or the people on each of our streets or in our neighborhoods, and that's really important to remember. And so then it's also a great question. I mean, why, out of all these people, choose this particular person as a character? For me, it was really important for me as a writer to understand what this particular character wanted. And to me, Claire is someone who wants to do something beautiful in her life. She wants to do something special, to make something special. And she also wants to not experience pain. She wants to escape from anxiety. And if that sounds like a lot of people whom you or I might know, then that should come as no surprise, because it probably sounds like all of us. And so to be able to write about something tangible and something beautiful, to me was really important, because that for me was a way to help the reader understand that there's a lot more to the life of this character than her issue of an opioid use disorder. And there's a whole side of her which animates her decisions, which ultimately is intertwined and made more complex by the opioid use disorder, but which is deeply to do with her alone.
Yeah. No, and you do that, brilliantly, and Vincent chooses a character with a route to addiction that's so sad and cliched, common. It's in society. Someone who starts with an injury and gets prescribed too much painkiller and stays on it for too long, and soon finds themselves with an opioid addiction, which is unfortunately a route that happens still every day in our society. But it's interesting that, music is such a recurrent theme, and we talked offline, but no one could have written this book without without the expertise you must have in violin and music, because you weave it into the story and it becomes integral. So I was going to ask you about your background in music and your own experience growing up, and then I had a follow-up question to that. So.
Sure, yeah, and you're absolutely right. Music is something which has been part of my life, and I always have a bit of an inner smile, because people, when they read the book, one of the first questions is, well, so you're a Chinese-Canadian doctor, and one of your characters is a Chinese-Canadian doctor. Where's the overlap and where's the autobiography? And the inner smile, or one of the inner smiles for me, is that very few people are perceptive and curious enough to ask, wait a minute, what about the violin? Which you have asked about. And so I spent a lot of time playing the violin, and from a very young age until the end of high school, I studied violin quite seriously. And then I used to busk in the Byward Market in Ottawa. Yeah, so and actually a few times at events in Ottawa, people have come up to me and say, hey, did you used to play the violin on that corner? And so that was my part-time occupation during high school and my undergrad, and I loved it. You know, I loved that form of interaction with the world and the world of the street. And so that's very much part of my own background, and of course the technical aspect of it in terms of understanding what playing the violin entails really helped me to write this character. But I think that the thing that I've been thinking about with respect to the role of music in this book is the notion that as an art form, music is particularly it evaporates. You know, it's I think the word is evanescent, and it exists in the moment. Of course, we can record it, but we're always imagining it in the moment of the performance. And it is the doing of it and the moment of doing it that matters the most. And it never truly exists after that moment.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about that a lot, both in terms of the role of music in this book, but also in terms of the role of each of our actions. Everything that we say, everything that we do, being potentially incredibly important just in the moment that it happens, and then resonates out from there.
Yeah.
So that's really where music lands here.
Yeah. No, and you get that sense from the book, and you know, as an aside, another thing Vincent and I share is that we were both musical prodigies, but unfortunately my career ended at the age of 7 when I showed up at my violin recital without my violin, and I never recovered from that faux pas, but otherwise I would be right there with you. But you talk about the ephemeral nature of music compared to other arts like writing and any kind of visual art that's permanent and always revisited. But it also makes it a very subjective experience, you know, and subjective in Claire's, particularly from Claire's perspective, in the sense that she's under the influence many times. And what seems to me, and I don't want to be over interpreting what you were writing, but your message was that one of the drivers of her opioid use was the sense that she could never reach what she believed was her sublime state in music without having, you know, that lift aboard her, you know, and I found that very interesting. Like, it was part of her pursuit of excellence, even though she knew it was ruining her life. She also felt she depended on it to achieve her artistic peak. And so was that deliberate? Am I overreading, or did that exist?
No, that's quite a perceptive reading, and certainly that's part of the deep tension of her dilemmas and the deep tension of the book. Because yes, she feels that her best possible self is under the influence. And certainly in my nonfiction life, I have met lots of people who feel that way. And so it's a really deep, crucial problem for her, because what it costs her to feel that way is huge. Yeah. And then meanwhile, Chen, as an observer from the outside, is also affected by that. I mean, most of us, right, if there's someone in our lives whom we care about, I think the starting point is, well, okay, if you want to feel a certain way, then I guess, sure, right? The tricky thing is when we can see from the outside that their desire to feel that way actually costs them a great deal.
Yeah.
And so I think we all have different forms of experience with that dynamic, and Chen has an experience with that dynamic with Claire because he admires what she does.
Yeah.
And yet he wants the best for her
Yeah.
as her physician.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, those are two really parallel, interesting points about the book. What you describe so realistically, and I've seen it in so many of the patients suffering addictions that I treat, is this constant awareness of the cost of their addiction, and the damage to the self-esteem and the damage to their sense of self, of what they have to do to perpetuate their addiction, of the damage they cause in their life. But still, they can be aware of that and can feel guilty about that, but the desire, the need, the hunger, is too much to respond to that. And I think you do that. The whole book, Clara is struggling with this awareness of what it's costing her. But, at the end of the day, she just needs that next fix so often. And so, and I'm sure, both as a observer of the human theater and also a doctor who treats this on a daily basis, you must see this all the time, no?
Absolutely. The book, of course, is a work of fiction, and so the specifics to do with the characters are entirely separate from my day-to-day life. But the emotional forces at work are very much the emotional forces which I understand from my nonfiction work as an addiction physician.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. Another one of your characters I wanted to talk about was Fitzgerald, or Fitz, who's obviously in your debut book as well. And honestly, the sort of morally ambivalent anti-heroes are, they're my kryptonite. I can't get enough of them, and he's very funny, and but he's so interesting in that, I don't think it's a lot to give away that he's near the beginning of the book. You find out he's a disgraced, or at least lost his license as a doctor, but he still found his own kind of unique and pragmatic approach to deal with the opioid crisis, which is, partly sort of commercial and monetary, but also out of I got the sense it was out of a deep sense of empathy as well, and he was trying to do his bit in a way that we may or may not all agree with. So where did that character come from, or at least that subplot for that character come from?
Yeah, Fitz is the sense of intuition and instinct, which we all have. He's that kind of first reaction thing, and all of us are in various situations that the first thought that pops into our head is, oh, we'll just do this, right? Except that he sort of lives that way.
Yeah.
The first thing that pops into his head, he just does it.
Yeah.
And he's also, I'm calibrating because I don't want to give away too much, but he also comes from a social class of great privilege, which for one reason or another, and I'll let you kind of come up with your own ideas in terms of why this is, he is kind of trying to defy. And he's kind of trying to not be in the particular class that he was gifted with. And so there's that as well. And so that complicates his motivations. And he's not particularly self-aware, as many of us, perhaps all of us, are not in so many of the things that we do. The things that motivate us the most persistently sometimes are the things that we don't see.
Yeah.
Or refuse to admit that we might be able to see if we looked harder.
Yeah, yeah. But see, the sense I got, and here's me, I'm like that, who's that character in the Annie Hall where he's interpreting the director's work, and they get, Woody Allen pulls the director in to tell him the guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and so I'm going to be that guy for a second. But in a way, he to me, he embodies the I don't give a shit kind of attitude, like, damn the torpedoes ahead, like he's got that thing that so many of, we all in a way strive for, that he doesn't care about the judgment, he doesn't care what other people think. He has his own seemingly internal rationale for the things he does and the decisions he makes, which on the surface you could think that's not right, or that's terrible, but his internal logic when he explains it kind of makes sense, and
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he's able to intellectualize what he's done after the fact.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. I didn't get the after the fact part, but there you go. Live and learn. And let's talk about, arguably the main protagonist, Dr. Chen, in this story, because he's such a compassionate, interesting character, and I love the fact that he's sort of, you were basically introduced to him in a form of mourning for all the loss that, he's already gone through, and he's got that Quixote-esque kind of, approach to the opioid crisis, right? Like that he's willing to try anything and do anything to make a difference. He comes across as so idealistic in his approach. Also self-aware. He knows his shortcomings, but he sort of he's pushes full steam ahead. And part of the narrative, part of the storyline, the way you tell it is a series of letters to one of his students to explain, nominally medicine, but also life really in those letters. And I think that's very powerful and very interesting. So what was it like, reviving a character that you had first written, 15, 16 years ago? And how did you decide to make the fictional choices in the direction in his life that he's taken since then?
Yeah, well, both of the characters, Chen and Fitz, kind of evolved into the book as it was being written. Chen relatively early, although I don't think he was there at the very, very start of the work on the book, and Fitz actually quite a bit later. I would say kind of the latter, let's say, third-ish of the 8 years that I worked on the book.
Wow.
So Fitz only appeared quite late, and so it wasn't a foregone conclusion for me that these characters would necessarily be in this book again. I started writing, I had ideas and scenes, and many were discarded, many were reworked, but they grew into the fabric and the life of the book, and I began to see that they were there. And so, once they had done that, then I certainly couldn't tell them that they couldn't be in the book. Yeah, Chen is, I think you've described him well. He's willing to go to lengths. He's willing to try harder. He's willing to always do more. And so then one of the things which is interesting and I think a bit heartbreaking for me when I read about this guy, now that I've written him, is that even though he tries to go to the lengths that are possible to help his patients, it doesn't mean that things always work out.
No.
And it also doesn't always mean that the right answer is obvious. In fact, he's still presented with conundrums and dilemmas and difficult choices where there's no clear right answer. And so that to me is really important, because I think the role of fiction, when it's really interesting, should be that it deepens questions. And if anything, that it makes questions more nuanced, maybe sometimes more ambiguous. It should cause us to challenge our previous answers. If we thought we previously had a clear answer on a particular issue, it should help us to challenge that. It should help us to understand the emotions and the dynamics that inform other people's choices and opinions. And so that's why I give Chen such a hard time.
You really do. You do
I really
give
do
him
give him a hard time.
Yeah, and as you point out, I think at one point in the novel that he's, his curse is that maybe he's falling in love, metaphorically speaking, with his patients, and in the sense that he sees a beauty and a hope in them that they don't see in themselves. And I found that whole idea somewhat poetic, but I wondered, do you think that particularly in your line, your newer, one of your many lines of work, but your current line of work in addiction medicine, do you think that's one of the curses? Because you have to be, trust me, for anybody who works in addiction medicine has to have boatloads of compassion. It's not something you can phone in, and you have to be willing to be disappointed a lot and still get up every day and try harder. So do you think that he represents what is common in you and your colleagues for addiction medicine?
Yeah, I think that that particular dynamic is absolutely part of what's crucial about the practice of addiction medicine. And I don't necessarily think that it's unique only to addiction medicine. I'm sure that it's part of the dynamic of other areas of medicine as well. But the concept that you identified, that there are moments when the doctor or the nurse or the counselor or the health professional who's taking care of someone who has this problem can imagine things that the patient in that moment might have difficulty imagining themselves.
Yeah.
Meaning can imagine a better future, can imagine a hopeful direction, can imagine that they can be the best possible version of themselves. And it becomes a very delicate thing because, of course, it is not useful if that professional foists a set of expectations or lays upon someone a set of notions or stereotypical expectations which are not true to themselves. That becomes an imposition.
Yeah.
But part of the nature of a substance use disorder is that there are moments when the person who is experiencing that substance use disorder feels so terribly that they can't imagine on their own the things that they otherwise would for themselves. And part of the treatment dynamic is, in fact, to see, to imagine, and in that way, although not romantically, to fall in love with the possibility that the future could hold.
Yeah, to believe in them when they no longer believe in themselves. Yeah, and another point you touched on, I think you really do a wonderful job of fictionalizing is the potential dangers of that all our doctors, that we all are at risk of, and that's becoming too personally invested in a patient. Not romantically, but just when you start, and especially part of one of the tenets of dealing with addictions, behavioral, is drawing boundaries that you have to draw. And as treating physicians, you have to, because out of necessity, if you give an inch to most addicted patients, they will always take a mile. So, and I think you draw it out very subtly in a very nuanced way, what the risks that can happen when you cross that line, when you do break some of your own rules, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful thing to write fiction, because I can take characters to the edge and then just let them fall over the edge and then see what happens, which is which is a bit heartbreaking, because I'm very fond of my characters. But at the same time is very freeing to be able to explore what happens next.
Yeah, no, it is. And really, you know, as I said, your portrait of addiction is harrowing and necessary, right? People have to understand. I don't think, you know, when I tell people, when I talk to people, there's multiple forms of addiction out there, you know, that are very destructive. Alcoholism, gambling, sex addiction that destroys families, destroys lives. But there's nothing remotely comparable to opioid addiction that just kills so many young people, you know, and so easily. And you know, and you don't shy away from that in this novel. There's a rising body count where we see, you know, and you see, and it's you know, it's not just the people that we identify in the downtown east side of Vancouver. It's everywhere, and I really firmly believe that opioid addiction touches almost everybody. And unfortunately, if it hasn't touched you yet directly, it probably will. And you show examples of dealers, you know, who are selling this effectively poison, but are poisoning themselves too. It's not just everyone gets their comeuppance when it comes to opioids, and so I don't know if people. Maybe now in 2023 people are aware of the lethality and the unnecessary lethality of it, but you know, was that a message that you were trying to convey, or you were just giving an accurate description of the situation?
I'm not sure that I really, and again, it may sound like a subtle distinction, but to me it's a very important one. I don't really think I set out to convey any message in any sort of agenda-driven way. What I really set out to do is to explore an issue which I think anyone who reads the newspapers will be aware of, to the extent that people can identify an issue, can identify certain features of it, but was to really explore it through the eyes of characters who are living it. And so by doing so, to deepen the conversation, to give more nuance to the conversation, and more so than to sort of to explain a certain message, perhaps to cause people to question whatever it is they already thought they understood about the issue at hand. But first and foremost, it's a book which is about characters.
Yeah,
it's about people who are living their lives. And the thing to me which really struck me when I began to practice addiction medicine, and which strikes me now, and which is very much part of the book, is this notion that the drivers are the drivers of substance use disorders, the drivers of addiction, are simply the drivers that each of us have in our lives. And they've been played out in an extreme way, and they've been played out in a way that's really damaging and hurtful. But they're not drivers that are present in some sort of alien species. You know, again, these drivers to want to feel good, these drivers to want to avoid pain and anxiety are what is present for all of us. You do that, and you know, and I can't get through a conversation without quoting Stalin, but he once said that the death of 1 million people is a statistic, the death of one person is a tragedy. And I think, you know, in good fiction, particularly this kind of heartbreaking story, you do that so well. I mean, you might not have set out to do that, but you personalize the opioid crisis for a lot of people who may not have been as affected by it. And so I think, you know, I think you're really doing a great service there. And any awareness that is raised to it, I think, is vitally important. But yeah, you talked about that, and in the letter that the foreword for your book, at least the letter I got, you wrote that the plot is driven by desire, and then you just alluded to that. But can you elaborate more on what you meant when you said that? Sure, absolutely. The plot is driven by desire for several of the characters. So Claire, she desires the creation of beautiful music. And Chen has complex desires. I really had to saddle him with a lot. He desires the best for his patients, and he's also an ambitious person who desires academic achievement. And he also has another kind of desire in that he wants to hold to what he understands to be the right way of doing science and making progress. And so there's part of him which has a desire to be right.
Yeah.
That is the right way to do it. So he has all these conflicting desires, and of course Claire is conflicted by her desire to both make beautiful music and to be well and to be healthy. Those desires run into one another. And then one of the things about desire, which is incredibly important, I think, in this book, is that desire is often a tension between the past and the future, which is taking place in the present. So Claire is remembering the way things once felt, how good it was once upon a time, and trying to achieve that thing which she experienced in the past by reaching for it into the future. And similarly, Chen is also very engaged in the memories of the student whom he's writing to. And some of the decisions that he's making in terms of how much to engage with Claire's care are in fact driven by his memories of how he felt in his relationship with this student, which was always chaste, but nonetheless there were sentiments. And I'm not giving away too much. You'll discover this fairly early in the book, but the student whom he writes to was also a lover of music. And so desire sits in the moment when one is making the decision, but desire is always something which is pulled by the past and which is propelling the characters into the future.
Yeah. And you do that. You interweave the stories really very seamlessly, and the fact that, you know, Chen had seen Claire perform before she became his patient, and you know, and his student had seen her perform. It really it gives a gravitas to the, you know, to the story and to the ultimate resolution. So yeah, I think you do that really, really well. You know, having grown up in Vancouver, like most Vancouverites, I have a deep, deep love for Toronto, and I do actually. I love going to Toronto, but Toronto becomes truly a character in your novel, you know, and just like the violin. Classical music is effectively a character in the story. So is Toronto, the beats of it, the areas you take us to, you know, even the title, you know, relates to an area in Toronto. And so was that a very conscious choice of yours to make it, you know, so integral to the story?
Again, I would say it grew out of the writing. I think it's absolutely correct that Toronto becomes a character, and Toronto, to me, is a city of multiplicities. There's lots of people, obviously, from all parts of the world, as there are in Vancouver, and there's also constantly lots of different currents running in different directions. The currents of business, of art, of healthcare, of the effect of substances on the city, of old money, of new money, of people who think that, well, this is our place, and people who have just arrived and who want to find a place. And so all of these things are constantly intersecting in Toronto. And so it was natural that should emerge in the book, and I agree it ends up being a character. But again, it feels like it was the book leading me more than me leading the book to do that.
Yeah.
And in fact, all through the writing of the book until the very last moment, probably until the last draft, the book had a totally different name. And the name of the book was Double Blind. And double blind, of course, for those in the medical profession, that'll be a very familiar term. The best type of trial is a double-blind randomized trial. And then there's also a double meaning in terms of the meaning of that concept within the book. And of course, you'll have to read the book to fully uncover that double meaning. So I have, a chance to kind of tease you here with that. But at the 11th hour, someone did a very tricky thing. Someone in England wrote a book and published it, and it was called Double Blind. And I thought, oh gosh, if only I just written a little bit more quickly, 7 years instead of 8.
See, there's the
Then it could have
difference.
been double
There's the difference
blind,
between me and Vincent Lam. I've been trying to name my last 10 books the Da Vinci Code, because nobody will go for it. But but it's interesting you talk about, because you also show the commercial side of the opioid crisis, but also the commercial side of the academic world. And I found that really interesting. We all know that so much of the opioid crisis is driven by short-term greed and mindless profit. But you bring in it's not too much to give away, that you give in the other side, that the therapy side, the potential, the development of potential treatments for the opioid crisis is also potentially driven by monetary gain. And Chen gets caught up in a bit of dilemma where he's, people are trying to influence him to make decisions that he's not necessarily comfortable with. And I thought that was very interesting, because I had not read much about that. So I know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the forces which really permeates this moment in world history, in fact, and that to me is not unique at all to healthcare, but certainly it's part of the intersection between business and research and science and healthcare, sure. And so we're at this curious moment where arguably the most powerful entities in terms of the development of new technologies, whether that's in technology or the pharmaceutical space, or the medical device or treatment space, are commercial concerns, right? And there's a lot of good that comes from that, because people take risks and they innovate and they apply creativity, and there's a lot of good that comes with that. And then there's also a lot of potential for conflict of interest. Yeah. There's a lot of potential for self-interested motivations to skew things in one direction or another. And so I think in so many ways we're wrestling with that as a society. And so that seemed to me to be also a very important dynamic to be writing about in writing about this issue, because it's part and parcel of how this issue came to be, and it's part and parcel of how we're trying to address this issue, like so many issues that we are trying to address, whether it's climate change.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Or this particular area of opiate use disorder.
So, what's your favorite part of the book?
My favorite part of the book, or my favorite parts of the book, are the musical sections. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed writing about music, and I really enjoyed experiencing music through Claire as well as through Chen, because they both experience music, one as the performer and one as the admirer. Yeah. And it was wonderful to be able to write about music in that way.
Nice. And were there moments in the story? It's not, it's not an entirely bleak story. There's lots of hopeful moments but there is lots of tragedy. So, were there moments that were difficult for you to write that you knew? I mean, I was telling you that there's one scene, And I think it's really masterfully done, where, you know, Claire's older sister is trying to help Claire out when she's going through dope sickness or withdrawal, and Claire, you know, witnesses the effort and the things she has to do to help her, and it's painful to read, but incredibly, you know, I think I'll remember that scene for years to come. But were there moments when you were writing this novel that you found it difficult, that you knew things were going to happen to characters that you didn't want to have to do to them?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there were many scenes in the book which were hard to write, in the sense that that I had to go to places that I knew were difficult and places that were painful to think about and to explore. But for me, that's one of the most important things that a novelist can do. If a novelist has, within the story they want to tell, these emotions and these, yes, harrowing situations in which their characters have to make some hard choices, then I think the novelist has to do that to honor the characters and to honor the situations in which they find themselves. And certainly for me as a physician as well, because of course there are the two hats, right? And there truly are two hats, you know, Vincent the writer and Vincent the doctor, but both of those hats go on the same head. So for me as the person wearing both of those hats, it's also tremendously important to go to these hard places, because that's a way that I can honor what my patients experience and what they go through.
Yeah, fair. It's interesting, you said earlier on, you said 8-year evolution, and that you'd written 2/3 of the novel without one of the, at least, main secondary characters. And so I can't even imagine the process. You said Chen, like Chen just seems so integral from start to finish. I can't imagine what this story looked like when you were starting. And so maybe you can share with us a little bit about your process of writing. And do you write chronologically and sequentially, or do you write, you know, more, do you skip ahead and go back and let the story evolve? I'm always interested.
Yeah, both for this book and the previous novel, The Headmaster's Wager, I had the same approach, which is that I wrote a really detailed outline of all the plot points and different things that would happen. And then as I began to write, that completely fell apart and became worthless and needed to be totally discarded.
Yeah.
And then,
most people would consider the main character as part of a detailed outline, Vincent, but I get your point.
No, I wish I could even have a stable cast of characters, but actually I've never been blessed with that yet. There's always the next book. So my process is I write a lot. You know, I draft a lot. I draft and discard hundreds of pages. So there's a lot of scenes. I mean, there's scenes that I wrote in great detail, which are quite vivid, where no version of that scene actually appears in the novel, because they're in totally different settings, they're totally different plot directions. But it's funny because I still know them actually quite well.
Yeah.
Because I spent a lot of time doing them, and I know why I didn't put them in the book. But in a funny way, for me, they're still part of the story, because they're how I got to this story and the way it is. So I kind of feel like my job as a writer is, you know, for a long time it's kind of me dragging it around. Mm-hmm. You know, where I honestly, all I really know when I start is I know how the book should feel, and I start writing and writing, and as I describe, discarding and discarding, you know, and this and that, and I can barely describe it because it's so disorganized. And I do that for a long time. But then at a certain point, and in this case, I think it was about it was about 3/4 of the way through, so at about year 6 or so. But at a certain point, what's always happened is the book begins to speak. The book just says, this is what it is. And then I know, then it's, and a neuroscientist would probably say, oh, well, that's because you sorted out certain patterns and blah, 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 blah. But I'm not a neuroscientist. All I know is that I get to that point, and then I know what should happen in the book, and then I'm very certain on the page. I'm very confident what I leave, what I take out, word choices, phrasing choices, metaphors. It really ceases to be me dragging the book around, and I feel like the book is just pushing me along.
That's right.
And that's a wonderful place to get to. But I've come to accept that it takes a fair bit of amorphous wandering to get there.
Yeah, that's such a skill, to be that disciplined a writer. Unwriting, for those of you who do write, and is the hardest thing to do, to spend, weeks and weeks writing scenes and chapters and be able to discard them like that. I don't have that discipline, and it's very hard. And once it's on the page, it's so hard to walk away from, because as you said, it sort of lives with you in the story, even if it never appears in the story. So that's amazing. But your prose is really, it's just so elegant. It's so, it doesn't feel forced, but it's still kind of, descriptive and poetic and vivid. And so it really is, I think all of you will find a pleasure to read this book.
Well, that's only because I got rid of all the stuff that wasn't like that.
There you go. See, now I'm getting some writer's advice. Now I know what to do when I go home. But that's great. I think we are starting to get questions from the audience that we're kind of like to transition probably at this point into some Q&A. So again, Leslie, is it info at the writersfest.bc.ca? So if you guys want to type anything on your phone, because I'm going to facilitate all the questions. So if there's anything that's come up that you want answers to, just text it now. And I think on the live stream, people can just write in the chat their questions and stuff. But we do have a few questions. The first one's a great one and a very general one. What advice would you give to yourself when starting out as a writer? And how would you find ways around obstacles when writing?
Yeah, great question. And I always feel slightly badly, because the things that people say, which are so cliched, are the true things. So I would say sit down and write, and also spend a lot of time reading. So those two things paired are the crucial things that one must do in order to write. And then the way to marry those is to develop the skill of reading your own stuff as if you didn't write it. Because that's where you gain the capacity to discern, okay, what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to get rid of and all that, which is pretty important. Obstacles, I think, I can all I can say is, what my approach to obstacles is. And my approach to obstacles is to just treat them as part of the process. In that, if the obstacle is that I've written something which I've now decided is really not what I want in my book, then just treat that as part of the learning process, part of the exploration, part of the journey. If the obstacle is I don't know what to write, then by all means, write something, and sometimes you'll write really, really terrible things in order to get to something which you then like. So rather than trying to get around obstacles, embrace the obstacles as part of the work of the writing. Those obstacles are there to teach a lesson about each of us as a writer and about the book.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said, and you made the point a couple times, and I would chime in myself because I get asked that often too, you know, from many aspiring and you know, accomplished writers, you know, where to start in that next book. And I think Vincent said, first of all, you have to be a reader, I think, to write. You just have to know. You have to learn from others that are further ahead on the journey on you. And the other thing that is so true is that you have to write. You just have to write lots. The analogy I always use is Tiger Woods, you know, and Roger Federer. They didn't come out and be the best of their sport just because they're super talented. The first time on the court, on the golf course, Tom Brady wasn't the best quarterback when he started. It's their dedication to honing their skills, and the only way as a writer you can do that is by writing a lot. And you know, to hear a master like you say that, you know, you throw hundreds of pages away, and you know, and even revisit drafts as much as you do, it tells you, you know, just how much your writing has to be honed for others to want to read it.
Yeah, I mean, it surprises people, but hopefully also, I hope kind of heartens people. I'm sure that I edit every page no less than 25 times.
Wow.
So there's no less than 25 passes, you know, from beginning to end of the process, and that's the way it is. I draft terrible stuff, but I'm not bad at editing it.
Perfect. I'm going to be sending you a whole bunch of first drafts as we go forward. It's a question that's interesting, is how do you maintain the same conversational style with the background medical information as with the story itself? I'm struggling with this in my memoir about a medical condition.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. I think the thing to think about, so that's a very specific technical question, sounds like it comes from a medical writer. The thing to think about is, what does the reader actually need to know to understand the scene? The reader doesn't actually need to understand the pathophysiology or the treatment options in the same way that a patient would. But there are other things that the reader must understand, you know, which the patient will intuitively understand, because the patient will intuitively, personally understand the emotional stakes.
Yeah.
Whereas the reader is not in that situation and may not understand the emotional stakes unless the writer helps them to understand the emotional stakes. So that's what I would say on that specific technical issue. You know, it doesn't have to be an informed consent disclosure as a doctor would give it.
Yeah.
But the reader needs different kinds of clues to understand the emotional dynamics.
Yeah. No, it's very true. That's a really good point. The reader doesn't need the technical details, right? You know, only, you know, Tom Clancy tells you how a submarine is built, but you can enjoy naval warfare without, you know, a good scene without understanding all the mechanics behind it. And that's very true, I think, of medical writing. It just has to have authenticity, and people don't need a detailed explanation of the medicine behind it if they can follow the scene and follow the emotional highs and lows that you're trying to convey. So, yeah. The next question is, you're both full-time physicians and best-selling authors. How does your emotionally demanding work in healthcare lend itself to creativity and imagination needed to write?
Well, I think for me, and I mean this is for both of us, so I want to hear what you think, Dan. For me, there's a lot of imagining that goes on in medicine. You know, what if things happened this way? What if things happened that way, rather than the way they happened? And that's often very fertile territory. People often ask me whether writing is therapeutic. You know, whether it's kind of like some sort of emotional processing. For me, I don't think it is actually. But I think what it does do is it sort of turns up the resolution on the image in certain ways. So meaning, although we can all sort of drift through life and not really see it in sharp focus, when we write something, I think we do have to see it in higher resolution and see it in sharper focus. And that's kind of, that's what it feels like to me in any case.
Yeah, no, I never thought about it in those terms. That's really interesting. I find the two are very complementary, you know. I mean, writing is as wonderful an escape as it can be, and certainly my most passionate hobby. It's also very solitary. It can be lonely. You know, you very much dive into yourself when you're writing, and you know, in my world, in emergency medicine, I'm meeting new people all the time. I'm interacting all the time. I'm fundamentally extroverted, so I get a lot out of that human connection. But I maintain, and I don't know if this is, I don't want this to sound grandiose, and I don't know if you agree, but I'm a better doctor, I think, because of the writer, because of, to your point, you have to, you know, analyze the decisions you make, and I think certainly I'm more compassionate, you know, when I read a book like yours, when I try to write some of my characters who are you know, troubled people, but you know, have good hearts, and I can recognize that in my patients. I think it helps, and I know that the work makes me a better writer. You know, for those of you who might have seen me in the hospital, I'm not going home and writing about you as soon as I get home, but just the overall experience, the human interaction. I mean, we get a front row seat to you know, human tragedy, human suffering, but also incredible compassion. When we see caregivers of people, you know, the people who are supporting people with disability and dementia, and you see an incredible side to humanity from our vantage point, and I think it makes it easier. I think that's why there are a lot of doctors who are you know, good writers, and so to me, I see them as very complementary careers.
Well said, I agree.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think, I know, I mean, I could talk to you all night, Vincent, and I will. We went skiing together last time around, and Vincent's a very good skier.
That's right.
He's even, I was, to my dismay, discovered he's even a better skier than me, but...
That's not true at all.
I had the advantage of growing up on the West Coast, but we have so much to talk about, and it's actually such a joy for me to be able to sit with someone who, you know, we've both pursued parallel, you know, careers, and it's great to be able to exchange ideas and learn from you, and your incredible talent. I really, honestly, you know, obviously, I'm here, but I wanted to be here. It's an honor, but I hadn't, when I accepted Leslie's invitation, I hadn't read Vincent's book, and now that I have, I am so glad I came. I really was very moved by this story. It's going to stay with me for a long time. I really, I can't recommend it enough. I think it'll open eyes. Maybe Vincent wasn't always intending to do that, but I think it will open your eyes, and even if it doesn't, I think it'll entertain you thoroughly, so I thoroughly recommend it for everybody here. And I just want to thank Vincent for coming to join us here in Vancouver, which I know will be the next great character in your novel. And I want to thank Jorge.
I'll have to spend more time here and we can ski some more.
Yeah, exactly. Whistler will become our great protagonist. And thank you, Leslie, for the Writers' Fest and for doing all you're doing. And thanks, everybody, for making such a great effort to come out and join us tonight. But how about a round of applause for Vincent?
And for Dan. And for Dan.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Vincent. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Leslie and the Writers' Fest, for curating another wonderful Incite event. Our friends from the Book Warehouse are right there selling books, so please go buy books, and then Vincent's going to be signing books over there. And before I let you go, I want to tell you about two events coming up soon at VPL. Next Wednesday, March 29th, we're hosting a conversation with Governor General Award-winning Inuk writer Norma Dunning, and she's going to be talking about her new memoir, Kinauvit, which is a book where she uncovers the history of the Eskimo disc system. which was a tool of colonization that reduced Inuit identity to a mere number. And she's going to be in conversation with another Governor General Award winner, Darryl McLeod. This event's going to be online, so they're not coming here. It's going to be online, and you can find all the details on how to sign up on our website, and that's next Wednesday. And then, of course, the weekend after, the Wednesday after that, on April 5th, is the next Incite, where the Writers' Festival has curated an evening of poetry because it's National Poetry Month. So come to that one. That's April 5th. And so the poets are going to be Jen Curran, Connor Kerr, Sherita Warner, and Bronwyn Tate. So come to that on April 5th. And then lastly, starting in April, we're going to kick off our yearly Uplift Asian series, which celebrates Asian cultures and perspectives and pushes back against anti-Asian racism in our communities. The event lineup is on the website, so you can go to Uplift Asian on our website. Just Google that, and you'll find the lineup. The kickoff event is going to be right here on this stage on April 12th with Lindsay Wong, who's going to be presenting her new book, Tell Me Pleasant Things About Immortality. So please come to that. I hope to see you all again here soon. Have a good night. Thanks for coming.